You can see, like, you think, whoa, it's Wordle. Of course, it's one word per game, right? But we're trying to build a Wordle system, so we need to think through these cases. Howdy, folks. Today, we're going to build on our previous Wordle video where we set up all of our data and what we want it to be, and we're actually going to build the database tables. So we are using a relational database, a SQL database. So let's start off. We've got our game. Okay, I'm just going to copy all this because it's easier. And let's figure out the actual fields. Game. So game type is going to be a foreign key. And we're going to use, so let's actually put our ID on here. Primary key. I'm not going to do the exact correct syntax, but you know, this is going to be an int, and guesses is actually going to be on the guess. Word ID, and game over and game one is extrapolated, so we don't need any of that. I'm not actually putting an official foreign key on this because I don't remember how to do that off the top of my head, and I don't want to read it, look it up. Okay, so word, this is going to be word, and this is word. So this is the thing. Normal Wordle is like a 5-letter word, but we might go longer. So let's maybe say like 30. I don't think there's words more than 30. Actually, that's really long. Let's go 10. I don't think it's reasonable if someone's going to go over 10, or if they do, we just tell them we don't support it. We can do that. You know, that is the thing we can do. Okay, so user. Okay. Create table. User. We have our username, we have our password, we have our email, which this is going to be our 30, 50. You want your email to be a little bit bigger. The rest of this, extrapolating. Okay, so now we want to know about, let's see, do we want to know what users in the game? Yeah, I guess we probably want to know what users are in a game, even if they haven't made a guess, right? So we're going to do a pivot table for that. And oops, this also needs an ID. Okay, so user game, pivot tables generally don't need their own ID. A lot of ORM systems create it anyway, but you don't need it. User ID and game ID. Why we do a pivot table for this? Because we don't want to preclude that there is only one user in a game. That's why. We just don't know. All right, so we have our guess. Okay, and this is going to be create table guess. And this actually doesn't have much data on it. It just has its own ID. And then it's the game ID. And the guess itself, actually, for the user, we have another pivot table. Just in case. User ID. And guess ID. And you can already start to see the complexity we're having to build in here. And the correct comes off of the actual guess. Guess data. Guess entry. All right. We have our guess entry now. Create table, guess entry, our guess letter. Okay. We have an ID for this, yeah. And see, almost everything does. Letter, let's use a char. I don't know if actually char is, I'll just do our char. I don't know if char is actually a thing that every SQL database supports. Position, tiny-int. Tiny-int, I think, is a single. You know what? We might not want tiny. Let's do small. Small int. We don't want a full 32-bit int, but tiny-int is actually really small. And then correct, this is going to be tiny-int, because that's just a 3 possible. We could use an enum for it even. All right, guess entry. Now let's do our game type. Create table. game type. Okay, and then we have our ID. We have our user count. Yes, count. These are all basically going to be ints. There's no reason to not have these as ints. Int. So I'm just going to copy this. Okay, so there's our tables. I did that pretty quickly, but the reason I was able to do that pretty quickly is because we already kind of talked through what all of our data was going to be last time. And that makes it really nice and easy. So let's think here. Okay, we have our game. Is there more flexibility we can add to this? The second question, of course, is do we want to add that flexibility? But let's see. We have our game. Okay, game has a game type ID and a word ID. So single word in a game. Well, okay, single word in the game. Okay, are we ever going to have a game where we have more than one word? We might, right? We might have a game where maybe it's like guess 3 words very rapidly. So which technically we could kind of treat that like 3 separate games though. So I think I'm okay with leaving that a single word per game. But you can see, like, you think, whoa, it's Wordle. Of course it's 1 word per game, right? But we're trying to build a Wordle system. So we need to think through these cases. And I think in any case, if we had a situation where we want to have multiple words show up, we could just start multiple games behind the scenes and just show them in the UI as multiple games that the user could pick. So I think that's okay. All right. Word. Do we want to at all have like a word list? Like maybe we have restricted words for the game. Maybe a user wants to create a series of games with their friends where they have like maybe 5 or 6 different words. That's a good question. Maybe we do want to do that. So maybe we have word list and a word actually belongs to a word list. Okay, ID word ID. And then this actually, instead of a specific game has a word ID, but maybe that specific game, let's also add a position, which is their position in the list. So maybe instead of a word ID here, no, actually we have the ID here. We don't need, position's still fine. We still have a word ID maybe, but now that is tied to a word list, and we can actually put that on the game type. So now when we're creating a new game, we look up the game type, and based on that game type, we figure out based on the word list. Yeah, because that also gives us the ability, it'd be a very complicated query, but that gives us the ability to be looking up for any game, the last game the user had here, the word ID and the position of that word, so we can figure out the next position in the word list. So then maybe that also is like, do we want to randomize the word list, right? Oops, I don't actually want to save this. That could be an interesting property of the word list, or maybe even of the game type. That actually seems better. Randomize words. The other question is, do I want a Boolean for that, or do I want an enum? Boolean's probably fine for now. But you can also see, like, I'm just trying to make things more flexible. I am going a little extreme with the flexibility here just to kind of make a point, but these are the sorts of things you got to be asking yourself. Okay, so now I even have a word list. So I have a game that could have specific words attached to a word list. That's pretty cool. That's pretty useful. Then, okay, create table user. There might be other data attached to a user, like maybe we do social data, but that doesn't need to affect the existing schema. That's stuff on additional, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. User game, that's fine. We might even have like a role on like what is the user, maybe like is the user owner, to invited, something like that, right? That might be a thing that we could use on here, because then if the user started the game, there might be like a lobby for the Wordle game, and that's the sort of thing we have to think about as well. Of course, if there's a lobby, we also need to do lobby chat, but we're not worried about that right now. You can see though, that's another feature I might be thinking about, and I want to make sure I have the data in there right now in the system, because nothing is worse than realizing you have to add data to an existing table or change data in an existing table when you already have data in production. It's very expensive to change. That's the main reason why I'm trying to go through it now and make sure I have all this stuff. Okay, guess. We already have user, we know the user, and we have the entry. There's not really much else we need on a guess here, I think. At the moment, we'll come back to that maybe. User guess, okay, it's just a user, the guess, it's a pivot table. Guess entry, okay, it has the letter, it has the position, it has whether it's correct. And it has, okay, and we know what user made that guess. What else might we want to have here? You know, it could be interesting. Well, no, we can always have that later. It could be interesting to know like what time the user made that particular guess entry, because then we could see like how slow they were to make the guess or how many times they backspace, that sort of thing. But a guess entry probably wouldn't actually, like, I don't know if we want to keep that as more statistical data. And then game type, this can always just be expanded as need be. There's not a lot extra here. As we add new parameters, we just put defaults for them in the system. That's pretty easy to do. So yeah, so you can see this has gotten somewhat more complicated. Now we've got a bunch of tables. They've got a bunch of interactions with each other. But that's good because this gives us an insane amount of flexibility. Of course, it does mean that it's actually a lot more complicated to figure this stuff out in the code because there's so much more things that could be possible. But the most important thing I like being able to say for a feature is when I get a feature request is the data supports it. Because if the data supports it, that feature request suddenly becomes so much simpler because we're just writing code. If the data doesn't support it, it means we have to modify data. Great. Do we need to backfill that data? Do we need to put defaults for that data? How easy is it going to be to do that? Do we need to worry about telling users, hey, your data might shift? There's a bunch of different complexity, and there's ways of handling that. But if you can say, yes, the data structure already supports what we're trying to do, that makes our life so much easier. And that's why we do this thinking ahead of time. You can see I could have just gone ahead, and by this point, I've already spent over half an hour on this. I could have already created an ORM in a system that just had some basic tables, but then I wouldn't have thought about it, and I'd be making mistakes or shutting myself off, not necessarily mistakes, but shutting myself off from possibilities down the line. So again, this is why we like to think about this stuff. The next video, we're going to talk about how to actually maybe create some pseudocode to deal with this massive structure of stuff that we've dealt with. I hope this is interesting, folks. I'll see you next time.